Shortly before 2 in the morning on July 7th, 1968, a waitress at Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue in Harlem sets down a plate of chicken, hominy grits, and a cup of black coffee. The man sitting at the table is 62 years old. He wears a custom sulker shirt. His hands are steady. His name is Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but the whole neighborhood calls him Bumpy. For more than 3 decades, he has controlled Harlem's underworld. He has survived a street war with Dutch Schultz that left over 40 men dead. He has struck deals with Lucky Luciano and the Genovese crime family that no black man before him had ever negotiated. He has done time at Alcatraz. He has been arrested more than 40 times. His estimated net worth sits somewhere between $8 million and $100 million. And even as he sits here eating his late supper, he is under federal indictment for drug conspiracy. Then Bumpy clutches his chest. His childhood friend Junie Bird catches him as he slumps forward. His eyes open one last time. He smiles. And then the Godfather of Harlem is gone. But Bumpy Johnson left behind more than a criminal empire. He left behind a family. A wife who would spend 40 years protecting his name, 2 daughters pulled in opposite directions by the world he built, a granddaughter who learned to count money from his gambling profits and grew up to shoot a mugger from her wheelchair, and a great-grandson who is still alive today, fighting Hollywood over who gets to tell his family's story. One daughter fell into heroin addiction, hooked on the same drug that built her father's fortune. One daughter vanished into silence so complete that almost nothing is known about her life. The granddaughter Bumpy raised as his own earned the nickname the Annie Oakley of Harlem. And the widow outlived them all, dying at 94, just 2 days after learning that a film company wanted to buy the rights to her book. This is what happened to Bumpy Johnson's family and why their story reveals that in this life the sins of the father do not stop at the grave. If you are new here, subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31st, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina. He was one of 7 children of William Johnson and Margaret Moultrie. The nickname Bumpy came from an abnormal bump on the back of his head that he carried his whole life. Even as a boy, he had a temper that scared his parents. In the Jim Crow South, a black child with a short fuse and no fear of white authority was a child on borrowed time. When Bumpy was about 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. In Charleston in the early 1900s, that accusation was a death sentence whether you were guilty or not. The family mortgaged their home and sent Willie north to escape the rope. What happened to Willie after that is unknown. No records exist of whether he was caught, tried, or what became of him. A few years later, fearing what their youngest son's temper might bring down on him, the Johnsons sent 14-year-old Bumpy to live with his older sister Mabel in Harlem. It was 1919. He never went back to South Carolina. Harlem swallowed him whole. He dropped out of school almost immediately. He fell in with street criminals, started stealing, started fighting, and started learning how the underworld operated. By the time he was 30, he had already spent roughly half his life behind bars on charges ranging from grand larceny to bribery to assault to pimping. He was broke, scarred, and directionless. Then, in 1932, after being released from yet another prison stint, he met the woman who would change the trajectory of his criminal career. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. They called her the Queen of the Policy Rackets. Madame Queen. She was a black woman from the Caribbean who had built the most profitable numbers operation in Harlem, and she ran it with an iron hand. But she had a problem. Dutch Schultz, the volatile white mob boss from the Bronx, had decided to expand into Harlem and take over the numbers game by force. Stephanie needed someone who could fight back. She hired Bumpy as her bodyguard and chief enforcer. What followed was one of the most violent turf wars in Harlem history. Bumpy organized his crew into roving squads that operated day and night. They bombed Schultz's collection points. They shot his runners in broad daylight on streets where dozens of people watched and nobody talked. They kidnapped his bagmen and sent them back empty-handed. Or not at all. Over 40 murders and kidnappings were attributed to the conflict. Schultz sent his own enforcers into Harlem to retaliate, but they were fighting on enemy ground. Bumpy Johnson, Bumpy's future wife, later wrote that picking off Schultz's men was easy because there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. They stood out like targets. Bumpy became a local hero for fighting back against the white mob's invasion, and the neighborhood protected him. Nobody gave him up. Nobody cooperated with police. The war made Bumpy Johnson famous. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated by Murder Incorporated at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. With Schultz eliminated, the Italian mafia no longer had a proxy fighting for Harlem. Bumpy saw his opportunity. He negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano, the most powerful mob boss in America. The deal was simple but unprecedented. Bumpy would control all of Harlem's rackets independently, running the numbers, the extortion, the loan sharking, and the protection operations as he saw fit. In return, he would kick a percentage of his profits upward to what would become the Genovese crime family. It was a partnership, not a surrender. It made Bumpy Johnson the first black man to sit at the table as an equal with the Italian mafia. The money that flowed from this arrangement was enormous. Numbers, extortion, loan sharking, protection, and eventually narcotics. Bumpy lived accordingly. Custom suits from Sulca, Cadillacs, a social circle that included Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Sugar Ray Robinson, and later, Malcolm X. He was known to quote Shakespeare in casual conversation. He wrote poetry that was published in Harlem literary journals and black literary reviews. People called him the Professor. He was equally comfortable discussing philosophy and ordering a man's death, and he did both with the same steady calm. His relationship with Malcolm X dated back to the 1940s, when Malcolm was a young street hustler known as Detroit Red. According to Mamie, the two men grew close over the years. When Malcolm left the Nation of Islam in 1964 and began receiving death threats, Bumpy offered to place armed men around Malcolm's family home in East Elmsford, New York. Malcolm declined. He said armed guards would damage his public image. Approximately 2 weeks later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom. Bumpy reportedly told Junie Bird afterward that Malcolm should have listened to him. But Bumpy Johnson was not a folk hero. The same man who handed out Thanksgiving turkeys to poor families and threw Christmas parties for Harlem's children was also the man who flooded the neighborhood with drugs and ordered violence against anyone who challenged him. His generosity was real, but it was also strategic. It bought loyalty, and that loyalty was enforced with fear. In October 1948, Bumpy married Mamie Hatcher. He was 43, she was 34. They had met 6 months earlier at a restaurant on 7th Avenue near 122nd Street. He sat down at her table uninvited, and according to Mamie, proceeded to talk about everything in the world. They left together, went to the movies, and that was it. The proposal came while driving in his Cadillac past 116th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue. He simply said he thought they should go ahead and get married. 2 weeks later, they did, in a civil ceremony. Together, they raised 2 daughters. Elise was Bumpy's daughter from a previous relationship. Her biological mother has never been publicly identified. Ruthie was Mamie's daughter from a prior relationship. According to the book description written by Mamie herself, neither daughter was the biological child of both Bumpy and Mamie, but they were raised together in the same apartment at 2 West 120th Street, apartment 3 Wine, in the Lenox Terrace complex. By every outward measure, it was a comfortable life. Bumpy spoiled his family with gifts, access, and protection, but the cost of that comfort was written in the lives destroyed by his business. In 1952, Bumpy was convicted of conspiracy to sell heroin and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was shipped to Alcatraz and assigned inmate number 1117. The Rock was reserved for the country's most dangerous and most notorious criminals, and Bumpy fit the bill. He spent over a decade there, surrounded by concrete and cold water, cut off from the streets that had made him powerful. During those years, Mamie held the family together alone. She raised 2 young girls and she managed the household. She visited when she could, making the long trip to the island in San Francisco Bay. She waited, and she kept his name respected on the streets, even in his absence. When Alcatraz closed permanently in 1963, Bumpy was transferred to a federal facility on the East Coast and eventually paroled. He returned to Harlem to what was described as a hero's welcome. Some accounts say crowds lined the streets. The neighborhood he came back to, however, had shifted beneath him. Heroin had replaced the numbers game as Harlem's dominant racket, and the trade was far more violent and far more destructive. Younger, more reckless men had risen in his absence, and they did not all respect the old arrangements. The Genovese family still expected their percentage, and the federal government, which had tracked Bumpy for decades, had not lost interest. Within a few years of his release, Bumpy was indicted again for drug conspiracy. He was still under that indictment the night he walked into Wells' restaurant for his last meal. But this life built on blood money had a fatal weakness. The man who controlled everything could not control his own heart. When Bumpy Johnson collapsed in that restaurant, his family was about to learn what life looks like without the Godfather's protection. On the night of July 7th, 1968, Bumpy was sitting with his childhood friend Junie Bird and associate Finley Hoskins. The waitress had just served his food. He took a few bites, reached for his coffee, and his hand went to his chest. He slumped forward. Bird caught him. Bumpy's eyes fluttered open. He smiled faintly. Then he was gone. He was pronounced dead at Harlem Hospital shortly after. The cause was a massive heart attack. He was 62 years old. They buried him at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners from every corner of Harlem and beyond. Politicians stood next to gangsters. Churchwomen stood next to women from the after-hours clubs. Numbers runners stood next to legitimate business owners who had paid Bumpy for protection and received it. In death, as in life, Bumpy Johnson belonged to the whole neighborhood. He was mourned not just as a crime boss, but as a man who had given Harlem something it rarely received from the outside world: power on its own terms. The neighborhood did not wait long to fill the space he left. Within weeks, a power vacuum ripped across Harlem. There was no heir, no designated successor, no one to step into Bumpy's shoes and hold the arrangement with the Genovese family together. The unified control he had maintained for over 30 years shattered into competing factions. Multiple players moved to claim pieces of his territory, and the violence that followed was predictable. The most famous figure to emerge from this chaos was Frank Lucas. Lucas later claimed he had been Bumpy's driver and right-hand man for 13 years, 9 months and 8 days. He said Bumpy died in his arms. He said Bumpy taught him the drug game from the ground up. This version of events became the foundation of the 2007 film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. Mamie Johnson called it a lie. She called Lucas a damn liar. She called him a flunky. She pointed out the math. Bumpy spent 11 years in Alcatraz, from 1952 to 1963. He died in 1968. That left only 5 years, not 13. She said Bumpy drove himself and never had a personal driver. She said Lucas was nowhere near Wells' restaurant the night her husband died. The actual witnesses were Bird and Hoskins. Lucas even got their home address wrong, pointing to a brownstone on 121st Street when they had always lived in an apartment building on 120th Street. Mamie also identified the real source of Lucas's story. She said much of what Lucas claimed actually belonged to a young hustler named Zach Walker, nicknamed Flash, who truly did live with the Johnson family for a period before betraying Bumpy's trust. Mamie believed Lucas took Flash Walker's relationship with Bumpy and claimed it as his own. What is not in dispute is what Lucas did next. He bypassed the Italian mafia entirely, established direct heroin connections to Southeast Asia through Leslie Atkinson, a former army sergeant, and flooded Harlem with a product called Blue Magic, sold in trademark blue bags. His crew, the Country Boys, was staffed exclusively with relatives from North Carolina. His operation dominated from roughly 1968 to 1975. Judge Sterling Johnson Jr., the special narcotics prosecutor who handled the case, later called the movie 1% reality and 99% Hollywood. The real Lucas, he said, was vicious, violent, and nothing like the character Denzel Washington played. Lucas was convicted in 1976 and sentenced to 70 years. He cooperated with authorities and was eventually released. He was caught dealing again in 1984, served another 7 years, and died on May 30th, 2019, at age 88. But the women Bumpy left behind had already been living with the consequences of his empire for decades. Their stories did not make it into any Hollywood film. Mamie Hatcher Johnson spent 41 years as a widow. She never remarried. She never even considered it, by her own account. She stayed in their Lenox Terrace apartment for over 30 years after Bumpy's death, maintaining the home they had shared, raising her granddaughter Margaret after Elise proved unable to care for the child, and attending services at St. Martin's Episcopal Church in Harlem. She became a fixture of the congregation and of the neighborhood. People who had known Bumpy still treated Mamie with deference, still called her Mrs. Johnson, still remembered what her husband had meant to the community. But Harlem was changing around her. The crack epidemic of the 1980s tore through the same blocks where Bumpy had once held court. The old social fabric unraveled. The Harlem that Mamie had known as a young wife in the 1950s was almost unrecognizable by the 1990s. Still, she stayed. In 2003, and approaching 90, Mamie moved to Philadelphia. She settled at Kearsley, a retirement community in West Philadelphia, to be closer to her goddaughter, author Karen E. Quinones Miller. It was Miller who finally convinced her to put her story on paper. At 93 years old, Mamie co-authored Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The book was published on February the 29th, 2008 through Ocean Publishing Company. Over 200 people attended the launch party at Club Zip Code in Harlem. Many of them had known Bumpy personally. For Mamie, the book was not about nostalgia. It was about correction. She was furious about the film American Gangster. She was furious about Frank Lucas. She was furious that a man she considered a flunky had turned himself into a legend by standing on her husband's grave. She wanted the record set straight, and at 93 she still had the fire to do it. In interviews, Mamie painted a complicated picture. There were other women during their marriage. There were the 10 long years while Bumpy sat in Alcatraz. There was the constant police surveillance, the wiretaps, the understanding that federal agents could come through the door at any time. But there was also genuine devotion. Bumpy showered her with jewelry and gifts. He took her everywhere. He treated her like a queen in a kingdom built on other people's misery, and she loved him for it until the day she died. On May 1st, 2009, Mamie Hatcher Johnson died at Kearsley. She was 94 years old. Sources differ on the exact cause. The Philadelphia Daily News reported respiratory failure. The Philadelphia Inquirer listed heart failure. What is certain is that she remained sharp until near the end. Just 2 days before her death, she was notified that a film company was negotiating to buy the rights to her book. She reportedly smiled at the news. She never learned the outcome. She was survived by her granddaughter Margaret, her great-grandson Anthony, her sister Lily Andrews, and her brother Melvin Hatcher. Both of her daughters had predeceased her by 3 years. Elise Johnson grew up in Bumpy and Mamie's Harlem apartment, surrounded by wealth, dangerous men, and the constant shadow of what her father did for a living. Her biological mother was never publicly identified. Her birth year was never documented. She was Bumpy's daughter from a relationship before his marriage to Mamie, and Mamie raised her without hesitation. Elise reportedly tried to attend college but was denied admission because of her father's criminal record. Whether this was written policy or quiet institutional prejudice, the result was the same. A door that might have led to a different life was closed. According to family accounts, that rejection pushed her toward the streets and toward drugs. The irony was devastating and inescapable. Bumpy Johnson had built a significant portion of his fortune on the heroin trade. The drug he sold to other people's children consumed his own daughter. Elise used heroin for years, shoplifting to fund her habit, cycling through the same desperate routine that thousands of other Harlem addicts lived and died in. She was not unique in her suffering. What made her story different was the source. The poison that destroyed her had paid for her childhood, her home, and the comfortable life she had been given. She was collateral damage of her own father's empire. Elise had a daughter named Margaret, but she was unable to care for her. The addiction made that impossible. Bumpy and Mamie took Margaret in and raised her from infancy, giving the child the stable home that Elise could not provide. For Elise, losing custody of her daughter was another wound in a life already full of them. The television series Godfather of Harlem, which premiered in 2019 on Epix, now MGM+, depicts a romantic relationship between Elise and Malcolm X. This is fiction. There is no verified evidence that any such relationship existed. While Bumpy and Malcolm were close friends, Elise's connection to Malcolm X appears to be a dramatic invention. Elise Johnson died in 2006. The exact date was never publicly recorded. The reported cause was a heart attack related to long-term substance abuse. She died the same year as her half-sister Ruthie, ending both of Bumpy's daughters' lives within 12 months of each other. Ruthie Johnson lived the quietest life of anyone in the family. She was Mamie's biological daughter from before the marriage, raised by Bumpy as his stepdaughter. Beyond that, almost nothing is documented. No interviews, no criminal record, no newspaper mentions, no trail of any kind. She chose total and deliberate obscurity, and she achieved it completely. Ruthie died in 2006, the same year as Elise. Her cause of death was never publicly disclosed. No obituary has surfaced. Whatever life she built it entirely outside the reach of journalists, historians, and the public eye. In a family defined by extremes, by wealth and addiction and violence and fame, Ruthie's silence is remarkable. She is the most private member of the Johnson family. She apparently wanted it that way, and the world has honored that wish. The loss of both daughters in a single year gutted what remained of the family's older generation. Mamie was now in her 90s. The only family she had left was her granddaughter and her great-grandson. Margaret Johnson was the daughter of Elise and the granddaughter that Bumpy and Mamie raised as their own. She was born around 1950, based on her age of 66 at the time of her death. Because her mother's addiction made it impossible for Elise to care for her, Margaret was taken in by Bumpy and Mamie while she was still an infant. Her childhood was extravagant. Private school, pony rides, a chauffeur-driven limousine. She was given everything money could buy, and the money buying it came from numbers, rackets, and drug profits. Margaret later admitted she earned her allowance by counting her grandfather's illegal gambling takes. She would sit on the floor of their apartment surrounded by stacks of cash, sorting and counting, not understanding at the time where the money came from or what it meant. After Bumpy's death in 1968, Margaret stayed with Mamie. She grew up in Harlem as the Godfather's granddaughter, which carried both protection and burden. Everyone on the block knew whose blood she carried. She grew into a woman who was direct, tough, and fiercely proud of the Johnson name. She eventually became a New York City bus driver, working for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. She reportedly drove the number 7 route and was known to regular riders simply as Lady M. It was honest work, blue-collar work, the kind of job that would have been unthinkable for the granddaughter of a crime boss during Bumpy's reign. But the money and the power were gone, and Margaret built a life with what she had. Her Harlem apartment told a different story than her paycheck. It was a personal museum, an archive of a vanished world. Prison records from Alcatraz, black and white photographs of Bumpy with Harlem luminaries, government surveillance documents, newspaper clippings, letters. She collected every scrap of paper that connected her to the grandfather she idolized, the man who had raised her when her own mother could not. She kept his memory alive the way Mamie did, through objects and stories and sheer force of will. She once told a reporter that she was always looking for Daddy in all the wrong places. It was a line that captured everything about her life. The grandfather who gave her everything had also been the reason her mother fell apart. On Friday, September 8, 2006, Margaret was 56 years old and sitting in her motorized wheelchair near Lenox Avenue and 133rd Street in Harlem. She was on her way to a shooting range for target practice. A 45-year-old man named Deron Johnson, who had 9 prior robbery arrests on his record, approached her and tried to snatch her purse and gold chain, choking her in the process. Margaret reached into her bag, pulled out her licensed .357 Magnum revolver, and shot him once in the left elbow. Police followed a trail of blood from the scene directly to Deron Johnson's apartment and arrested him. Margaret was not charged. She had a valid permit for the weapon, and the shooting was ruled justified self-defense. Deron Johnson was later acquitted at trial after his defense attorney argued that Margaret's dog had attacked him first. Then in March 2009, he turned around and sued Margaret and her landlord for $5 million, claiming permanent nerve damage in his arm. Margaret, represented by attorney Ron Kuby, was not intimidated. She told reporters she was a peaceful person, but she wished she had killed him. She said she did not know you had to pay to get mugged in New York City. New York State Assemblyman Keith Wright gave her the nickname that followed her for the rest of her life. After the shooting, he started calling her the Annie Oakley of Harlem. On Monday, December 12, 2016, Margaret Johnson suffered a massive heart attack. She fell into a coma. Doctors eventually determined there was no path to recovery and took her off the respirator. She was 66 years old. Her death was confirmed by Assemblyman Keith Wright to the New York Daily News and reported by Harlem World magazine. She was survived by her only child, Anthony Hatcher Johnson. With Margaret's death, the last woman in Bumpy Johnson's direct family line was gone. Raymond Anthony Hatcher Johnson was born on April 28, 1970. His mother was Margaret Johnson. His father was Albert Anderson. He grew up in Harlem, in the same neighborhood his great-grandfather had once ruled. But by the 1980s, that neighborhood bore little resemblance to Bumpy's kingdom. Crack cocaine had replaced heroin, and the streets were a war zone. Anthony decided the only way out was the military. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and served 3 years, including a deployment to Okinawa, Japan. The Marines gave him structure, discipline, and distance from the violence he had grown up around. After his honorable discharge, he did not return to the streets. He turned to music. Anthony became the lead vocalist and multi-instrumentalist for a band called the OAI, which stood for the Original African Indians. The group blended hip-hop, jazz, heavy rock, and West African percussion into something that did not fit neatly into any genre. It was ambitious, experimental music that reflected Anthony's refusal to be defined by anyone else's expectations, including his family's criminal legacy. They performed at the Glastonbury Festival in England in 2011, 2015, and 2016, playing before crowds of up to 65,000 people. For the great-grandson of Bumpy Johnson, standing on a stage in Somerset, England, leading a band that fused African drumming with rock guitar, was about as far from Harlem's numbers racket as a man could get. Anthony settled in Hollywood, Florida, near Miami. He became the executor of the Bumpy Johnson estate and registered the trademark for the name Bumpy Johnson on November 16, 2017. Through a company called Johnson Family Films, he has been developing a television pilot called simply Bumpy with his childhood friend and business partner Damon Eden. He has also been publicly and persistently critical of the series Godfather of Harlem, starring Forrest Whitaker, which premiered in 2019 and has run for 4 seasons. Anthony has stated that the show's producers never contacted him, never acknowledged the family's existence, and never consulted the book his grandmother co-authored. Co-author Karen E. Quinones Miller confirmed this, saying the producers used an obvious play on their title without reaching out. Anthony's sharpest complaint has been the show's claim that his mother Margaret had godchildren she left behind. He called it a money-grabbing fabrication. His mother, he says, never had any godchildren. When Margaret suffered her fatal heart attack in December 2016, Anthony was living in the United Kingdom and had been away from New York for over 13 years. He launched a crowdfunding campaign on Just Giving, seeking £15,000 to fly home and cover medical expenses. He raised just over £2,000 from 48 donors. He made it back in time to be at her side before she was taken off life support. Anthony Hatcher Johnson is, as of today, the last known living direct descendant of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Whether he has children of his own has never been publicly confirmed. The bloodline runs from Bumpy to Elise to Margaret to Anthony, 4 generations spanning from the Jim Crow South to Alcatraz, to a motorized wheelchair with a .357 Magnum, to a stage at Glastonbury. Anthony has spent years fighting for control over how his family's story is told. The deal that built Bumpy's empire, the one that set everything else in motion, was the partnership he struck with Lucky Luciano after Dutch Schultz was killed in 1935. That single arrangement gave a black gangster from Charleston an equal seat at the table with the most powerful mob boss in America. But Luciano built an empire of his own. The people he left behind paid their own price for it. If you want to see what happened to Lucky Luciano's family, watch this video right here.